And so here we are, moving past the 3 starter Pokemon and getting into the real meat of the Kanto Pokedex. No more talking about how scarce they are because of the SPC, or how you have to pay a breeder out the butt just to get one. Now, we can get more into the common boys and girls. To kick us off, let's talk about bugs. Specifically, Caterpie and its following evolutions. So, Caterpie is a small, foot-long, green bug Pokemon with suction cup-like feet along the bottom of its body and a large red horn-like protrusion on its forehead. I'm sure almost everyone has seen them outside at some point. They're very, very common, especially in the warmer months. Caterpie then evolves into its next stage of Metapod, which is its chrysalis form between the first and third evolution. Metapod looks like a small green crescent moon that has 2 eyes near the top. Shortly after becoming a Metapod, the Pokemon will evolve again and become a Butterfree, a 3-foot-tall butterfly with white and black wings and a purple center body. They're most common in the Kanto region, of course, but they can also be found all over the world. Despite being small prey Pokemon, they've become very successful everywhere they're introduced. But, just because it's common, doesn't mean that it's the right Pokemon for everyone. So let's get into it and see if these are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. For the first 3 care guides that I've done for the Kanto starters, the enclosures for 2 out of 3 of them have been fairly large and involved, changing at least part of the environment around them. For Caterpie and its subsequent evolutions, it's almost the exact opposite situation. You see, for your Caterpie to live healthy and happy, it really only requires one thing. A tree. Any old tree. Look outside. Do you see a tree? If so, then you already have the perfect habitat for a wild Caterpie to live in. Now, I'm going to suggest a different kind of enclosure that'll keep your Caterpie from wandering off and, more importantly, being taken as prey by one of the many predators that they have. That's not to say that you couldn't just put your Caterpie in a tree and leave it there. You absolutely could. My parents do, and they raise enough Caterpie to cover a couple dozen trees. But that does hold a lot of risks for your Pokemon. So I'm going to tell you how to set up an enclosure that'll keep your Pokemon happy without putting it at risk. When making an enclosure for your Caterpie, the big things to keep in mind are warmth, vertical space, and climbing decor. Let's talk vertical space first. Caterpie love to climb. It's almost the only thing they ever do besides eat. So, when making your Pokemon's enclosure, you'll want to make the frame in the dimensions of 3 feet by 3 feet on the bottom, and then 5 feet tall. The frame can be made out of any material. Caterpie can climb anything with their suction cup feet, but the easiest to get a hold of and build with would probably be wood. The walls of the enclosure bring me to the next topic: warmth. Caterpie, its evolutions, and most other bug-type Pokemon live in warmer climates. If you live somewhere like Alola where it's warm all the time, then you can set up your Caterpie's enclosure outside and even use a netting for the walls to allow good airflow through the enclosure. Now, that's not needed for the Pokemon's health. But if you are going to have netting, then you're going to want the airflow for yourself, because the red horn that Caterpie has reeks to Arceus. The smell acts as a defense mechanism to ward off potential predators, and it is very potent. By allowing good airflow, the stink will get blown out of the enclosure and away from you and your Caterpie. But if you don't live somewhere that's warm all year round, then I would suggest keeping the enclosure inside and using glass walls instead. It will, unfortunately, almost take up the same space as a fridge, but at least you can place it anywhere in your home. Just make sure that you either have a door installed on the side, or make it so that one of the glass panels is removable so you can get in to clean it. As for the inside of the enclosure, just a few branches that the Pokemon can use to climb should be fine. You can use fake branches, but just make sure there aren't any fake leaves on those fake branches. Caterpies are voracious eaters, and if something even so much as looks like a leaf, they will take a bite out of it. But we'll cover food later on. Oddly enough, Caterpie is an example of the Pokemon that gets easier to care for when it evolves. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's an amazingly pleasant event. As for how to care for a Metapod, you pretty much don't do anything to it. When it evolves, your Pokemon will either have attached itself to the branches in its enclosure using string, or will have settled itself on the floor of the enclosure. Either way, just grab it from wherever it's sitting and place it somewhere warm while you wait for it to evolve again into your Butterfree. Use it as a paperweight on your desk, a cuddle buddy during the night, or heck, just leave it on your counter near the sink. Just somewhere that you can keep an eye on it. Butterfree is also a low-maintenance Pokemon, but for different reasons than Metapod. You see, as a Butterfree, the risk to them from bird Pokemon goes way down. Butterfree have a natural defense mechanism, just like Caterpie with its smelly horn, but theirs is much more effective. When a Butterfree flaps its wings, it scatters poisonous scales in the air around it. These scales, while not deadly, can cause irritation, blindness, and even partial short-term paralysis. The scales are highly effective against all but fully evolved flying types, but thankfully those kinds of predators aren't common in the wild. Fire types could do damage too, but they aren't nearly as common in the wild as flying types. The problem is that the scales are also effective against people. Once your Metapod evolves into a Butterfree, you'll have to move it outside as a necessity to avoid poisoning yourself, which, you know, is bad. Moving it outside is really the only option at this point. Luckily, like I said, only fully evolved flying-type Pokemon can really do any kind of damage to a Butterfree now, so the risk of living outside is minimal at best. To further reduce that risk, you can build a small enclosure for your Butterfree. Really, it's going to be just more of a room, a place for your Pokemon to sleep at night and get away from any bad storms. The best way to do so is to make a wooden box, about 4 feet cubed to allow for the size of the Pokemon's wings, and attach it to the side of a tree, just under its lower branches. Then, on the side facing away from the tree, instead of a wooden wall, you want to make sure it's a heavy-duty rubber flap, like what they use for Pokemon doors for them to get in and out of a house. That way, it'll allow the Butterfree to come and go as it pleases, but won't let things like rain in. After that, just keep an eye on the box and make any repairs that are needed. The Butterfree should start to line the box with plants on its own once it feels comfortable enough in its new home. Always keep in mind that the specs for the enclosures I gave you before are only rated for 1, possibly 2 Caterpie, and only 1 Butterfree. If you plan on housing other Pokemon with them, you'll have to either build a separate enclosure for those Pokemon, or adjust how you plan on housing your Caterpie evolution based on the Pokemon you'll be housing with them. Of course, other Caterpie evolutions are a yes. They're found in the wild in large nests, all living together. Just remember, you'll need space for them. And having a full nest of Caterpie can strip trees clean of leaves in weeks. Trust me, Mom and Dad have to rotate the Caterpie around from tree to tree each month just so they don't kill the trees by eating all of the leaves. You'll want to avoid fire types and flying types with them at all costs. Like I said before, they are the common predators of this species, and putting them together can be very, detrimental to your Pokemon's health. Just remember, I recommend keeping your Caterpie inside to avoid the dangers of flying types. Don't go sticking them together. Let's see. Anything carnivorous would be bad unless you have a Butterfree to keep the younger evolutions safe. Caterpie and sometimes Metapod can make easy prey for carnivorous Pokemon. Grass types would be a good fit to house with them, ones like Badoo, Shroomish, things like that. Fairy types might also be a good fit. They tend to be caring Pokemon that'll take a shine to small Pokemon like Caterpie. Just things that aren't aggressive and will leave smaller Pokemon alone are what you're aiming for. Availability. We are going to do a small experiment. I want you to take out your phone, go over to your GPS, and find where the nearest forest is. Then grab an empty Pokeball and just walk around that forest for like an hour or two, you'll probably find a Caterpie. That's how easy it is to find these Pokemon. Now, of course I'm exaggerating, but not by much. They are almost everywhere. Eterna Forest, Lush Jungle, Viridian Forest, all of them. Out of all the different regions, the only two that don't have native Caterpie populations are Hoenn and Unova. And even if you live there, you can 100% find a breeder near you who is breeding and selling them. My parents did, still do as a matter of fact. They produce dozens and dozens of Caterpie per breeding season, and they are only one of hundreds of breeders of Caterpies out there. I personally don't breed them myself, partly because I have slight childhood trauma from being cocooned in string when I was really young while cleaning out the Caterpie nests, and partly because they're such a common Pokemon. If you want a Caterpie, you'll be able to find one, easily. Care. Following in the pattern of setting up their enclosure and getting a hold of one, the care for a Caterpie and its evolutions is very easy to handle. Starting off, their enclosure won't need much upkeep at all, aside from some regular cleaning. Sticky string will begin to accumulate inside their enclosure, hanging off the branches and the sides. This won't bother your Pokemon much, as in the wild they tend to live in nests made of the stuff. But the bigger problem is that other stuff, like the Pokemon's waste, can get caught in the string, and if left there, it can become a health risk. As Caterpie grow and get bigger and closer to evolving, they will shed their old exoskeletons, growing a new one as they do so. These old shell bits will also get caught up in the string. So, every few days, take the Pokemon out of the enclosure and use a Pokemon-safe dish soap to help dissolve and clean up the excess string. Then, let it dry, and once it's completely dry, you can replace your Caterpie and it'll all be good. I'm not really going to mention Metapod here. It doesn't move, it doesn't eat, it doesn't even make noise. The most cleaning you'll have to do is making sure that dust doesn't accumulate on it from wherever you put it. But Butterfree's enclosure will need to be cleaned out just like Caterpie's. They don't leave string everywhere, and since they should be living outside now, aside from their box, all their waste is going to be outside. No, what you'll need to clean out are all the wing scales that build up in its treehouse. Like I said, as Butterfree flaps its wings, it spreads poisonous scales around in the air. Normally, the wind is enough to take care of this, and it scatters them around. But inside the box, that's not going to happen. All the scales that come off your Butterfree's wings while it's sleeping or eating will just build up in piles on the floor and in the corners. The best way to deal with this is to put on a pair of goggles and a mask so the scales don't get into your body, and vacuum them out about once a week. Please be careful when doing this. The scales may not be deadly, but if you inhale too many of them, it's going to lead to a trip to the doctor. And nobody wants to be the guy that had to go to the doctor from Butterfree poisoning. Moving on to food, it's probably the easiest diet that I've gone over so far in these care guides, which isn't saying much since it's only the fourth one, but still. For Caterpie, you'll need a water dish, one of the ones that hangs from the walls. You can get one of the ones that sits on the bottom of the enclosure, but that'll quickly get full of cast-off string and falling detritus from food. The one that hangs on the wall of the enclosure, while not free from the possibility of getting string in it, means you'll really only need to clean it every now and then when you need to replace the water. Speaking of the food though, I promised it would be easy, and it is. Leaves. Just regular old leaves. You have to remember that they live in trees in the wild, and all they eat is leaves. The best way to feed your Caterpie is, in the morning, you go outside, grab a big handful of leaves, and then drop them into your Pokemon's enclosure. It'll start nibbling on them almost instantly. Repeat that every morning, and if you happen to pass by the enclosure and see that they've eaten all the leaves, just go grab another handful. Remember that a Caterpie's only goal is to eat enough to evolve, and giving them all the food they can eat will only move them along in that goal. Once again, we're going to ignore Metapod. It doesn't eat anything. I'd call it a rock, but there are plenty of rock-type Pokemon that are actually more work to take care of. As for Butterfree, you have two options. The first is the natural route, letting Butterfree collect its own food from the environment. To do this, you'll need to plant plenty of flowers around the spot where you have your Butterfree's box hung. Then, your Butterfree will naturally go to those flowers to collect pollen to make honey to eat. The second option is to leave a small dish of honey out for it. Not in the box. In there it will quickly get covered in wing scales. But just leave it on your windowsill or your front porch. Your Butterfree will come over, eat its fill, and fly off. A little tip is that if you do this at the same time every day, then you will eventually train them to eat at that time every day, and they will approach you as you bring out their food. One last bit about caring for these Pokemon. During this whole care guide, I've been talking about what to do if you live in a warm climate, or if it's the warm season where you live, and how to take care of them during that. But what about winter? Well, bug Pokemon like Butterfree and Caterpie have plenty of different tricks to deal with the winter. So, let's say that you keep your Caterpie outside, or that you have such a large colony of Caterpie evolutions that they won't fit in your house. Well, don't worry about their health when things turn cold. At some point in the fall, usually after the leaves change color, but before the majority of them begin to fall to the ground, the cold temperatures will cause the Caterpie and their Butterfree to enter a sort of dormant state, hibernating through the winter in a warm, cozy spot. Usually, this means inside their big nests of string, and if you have your Caterpie outside, it will do just that. It'll make a big string ball at or near the top of its enclosure and encase itself in it, trapping in heat and keeping it safe for the winter. Butterfree, since it's already living outside, if you've been following my guide, will simply enter its box and hibernate in there for the winter. This is one of the reasons that I mentioned getting a heavy rubber flat for the door. Most of the heavy-duty ones will trap in heat and keep out the cold while your Butterfree hibernates through the winter. Metapod, well, its shell is designed to keep it safe for the winter. Short of burying it in a snowbank, the winter isn't going to affect it much. But no matter what evolution you have, during the winter, just remember to check on them every few days to make sure the string ball is still intact for Caterpie and that your Butterfree is still sleeping healthy. Cost. Now, after the first 3 guides for the starters, I'm sure you're expecting me to say that the Pokemon is going to be expensive, and that you'll be spending most of your money there. Well, thankfully, you'd be wrong. In fact, you're not going to have to spend much money on this at all. Acquiring the Pokemon could possibly be as cheap as the price of a Pokeball if you go out and catch one yourself. And even if you decide to get one from a breeder or a personal seller, your costs won't be much higher than the low category. Like I said earlier, there are hundreds of breeders out there that are selling these Pokemon. And because the supply is so high, that means that the price has dropped to a nearly record low. Even if you don't want a Caterpie and want one of the later evolutions, it's not going to increase the price very much at all. In the same vein, food won't cost you much either. Caterpie will be free, just walk outside and grab a handful of leaves. Unless you're taking them from someone else's land, then you shouldn't have any trouble, and if you are doing that, stop it, that's rude. Butterfree, it depends on how much you want to spend on flowers, but at a minimum, you should be spending at about the upper rung of the low category, possibly into the moderate category. Surprisingly, flowers aren't cheap for some reason, and you'll need enough that your Butterfree doesn't keep going to the same ones day after day. It's all about how willing you are to put into the work to find them. Really, the spot where you're going to spend the most money is the enclosure. And by the most, I mean not much more than the moderate amount. You'll need wood, glass, and screws for Caterpie's enclosure, along with decorations like sticks and rocks, but again, just grab them outside, and then just wood and screws for Butterfree to make its tree box. The raw materials will probably put you somewhere in the middle of the moderate price category. Of course, you could always buy a prefabricated one online and have it shipped to you, skipping the need to go out and figure out how to build them yourself. Less work, but they are more expensive, putting you more in the higher range of the moderate price category. They aren't better, at least not usually, but they do save a lot of hassle getting the raw materials and putting it together yourself. Just searching from them online should bring up plenty of results. Conclusion. Personally, I think Caterpie and its evolutions are great first Pokemon, especially for kids. They're easy to care for, you can keep them in your house, at least before they're a Butterfree, and they look awesome in their enclosure. They aren't dangerous, and you can honestly take them out of their enclosure and interact with them really well. It builds a strong bond between owner and Pokemon. It's one of the reasons that the Caterpie line is so popular worldwide. It's also great for people that just don't have the time to invest in a Pokemon that needs constant training and attention. Getting one of these won't be a full-time job just to care for a Pokemon. Give it food and a bit of attention every now and then go on with your day. So, I personally think Caterpie and its evolutions are great Pokemon to have and could absolutely be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for tuning in, and next time we'll be going over what many people consider to be the counterpoint to the Caterpie line, the Weedle line. Which, oh boy, that's gonna be something. Have a wonderful night, everyone.